We were supposed to change the world. What happened? I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life. On each episode of my weekly podcast, a different topic, discussion, or story from our lives.
Season 16, Chapter 1.
Change.
The world.
We were the counterculture, the boomers, dissatisfied with the status quo. Fueled by sex, drugs, and rock and roll, we were to take down the man and all his hypocrisy, peace, free love, and a new way of thinking. We were supposed to change the world. We didn't. Or maybe we did, and it just changed back. What happened? Let me first recap what I mean by our counterculture, sometimes also known as the hippie movement of the 1960s. I don't think calling it the hippie movement really does it any justice. But what is justice? Hard to tell. Counterculture itself is not new. A classic example of counterculture was a group known as the Levelers. The Levelers came to prominence near the end of the English Civil War in the mid-1600s. They fought for equality, religious tolerance, extended voting rights, and more. In the mid-1800s, the women's suffrage movement began. There was the Beat Generation, aka Beatniks, the civil rights movement, hell, even the Bolsheviks in Russia. These are all countercultures. A culture is a group's shared beliefs, values, and behaviors. Certain cultures gain prominence over others. And throughout history, countercultures have always sprung up to take on the existing condition. The Beatniks, the Beat Generation, were a literary and artistic movement of the 1940s and 50s, challenging the modern state of affairs. Some say that the 1960s hippies were an outgrowth of the Beatniks. Yes, no, maybe, I'm sure some Beatnik parents had some hippie babies here and there, but the 1960s counterculture was really its own thing. And by the way, the 1960s counterculture is where I come in. Maybe a little too young for it at the beginning, but really just about the right age when it really started to gain momentum and ramp up. I.e., it spoke to me. Don't trust anybody over 30. Hey, I hear you, man. To me, the big difference in the impact between the beatnik and the hippie movements was television. The Levelers had to hand out pamphlets in not-so-jolly old England. Suffragettes carried picket signs to the town square. Beatniks read poetry in dark cellar nightclubs. But the hippies? The hippies were on TV for the world to see, and eventually in living psychedelic color.
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Today, of course, it's social media. Social media is simply television on steroids. Television fed the movement. Initially, TV resisted the counterculture until they couldn't. Until counterculture became a prized, profitable demographic. Granted, their original attempts at catering to it were a little lame. Rowan Martin's Laugh-In and the Monkees. But counterculture was on network TV. It was also on the news. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. They were called baby boomers for two reasons. The main one being the spike in the birth rate post-World War II, a literal baby boom. Also, these children in North America were being born into boom times. And what I'm trying to do here is set up why a counterculture would even need to form when seemingly things were so good for everyone. And of course, things are rarely good for everyone all at once. And by the 60s, television began to expose that. But also, history tells us that the United States was very rich and a world economic power during those boomer times. And because it profited from war. I just covered this in a recent podcast. U.S. manufacturing was able to pivot, especially during the Second World War, and produced most of the armaments for the Allies. Now, don't get me wrong, fighting Hitler did require all hands on deck. Defeating him was a good thing. Nevertheless, the U.S. insisted that they be paid for all the wartime manufacturing in gold. By the end of the war, they had 80% of the world's gold stockpiled in Fort Knox. They were able to assemble all the free nations and declare the U.S. dollar as the world currency, supported by that gold standard. Plus, the big war did not take place on U.S. soil. I mean, Hawaii, but it wasn't even a state yet. So it was that Europe was in shambles. And guess who also profited from helping to rebuild it? The United States, and this is ingrained in their history, profits from war. So much so that by the late 1940s, times were booming. Let's have a family. Babies were booming. One of those war generals was elected president of the United States. People had homes and hot rods. And other than a few UFO sightings and those disgruntled beatniks, times were good. And again, rarely is everything good for all the people all of the time. But generally, pretty good. The peak of this euphoria came in 1960 with a dynamic, young, television-friendly presidential candidate named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy gave us the dream of landing on the moon. He founded the Peace Corps and USAID. Yeah, that one. Recently dismantled by Trump and Elon Musk. I wonder what that's going to do for Elon Musk's re-election hopes. That USAID, founded by JFK. The White House was dubbed Camelot. Now, I know since then we've found out a little bit more about the Kennedys, some of the personal choices they made in that era. But then it was Camelot. Didn't last that long. November 22nd, 1963, they assassinated the president. They. Who they? Russians? Cubans? CIA? The mob? All of the above in some evil cabal? Did it matter? A president was dead. So was an era.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The pink Chanel suit that was America was permanently blood-stained. The seeds were sown for the growth of a counterculture. And let's not discount the war in Vietnam. One of the first wars to be brought directly into our living rooms via television. A war halfway around the world that was supposed to represent American values and beliefs like freedom and democracy. North Vietnam was backed by the Soviet Union and China, among others. The USA not directly battling those enemies, but in this proxy war, the U.S. using conscription, the draft, to force young Americans to fight the war, boots on the ground, and in the swamps and the rice paddies. The weapons included bullets and missiles and napalm.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. It smells like victory.
The first hard evidence of a 60s counterculture came from the anti-war movement. It was a war that seemed unnecessary. In spite of any American profit, the movement to end the war. And our weapons included the Beatles, Creedence, and Bob Dylan. Quick aside on the Beatles, I'm a fan. I'm a Beatles baby boomer baby. Greatest band of all time, a body of work unrivaled in music history. But also they were benefactors of right place at the right time. It's been written about many times. The end of 1963, America, a country in mourning, still stunned by these devastating events that could happen on their own soil. 11 short weeks later, enter 4 smiling mop-top lads from Liverpool. It was the perfect distraction. Love Me Do.
These youngsters from Liverpool, England, and their conduct over here not only as fine professional singers, but as a group of fine youngsters will leave an imprint with everyone over here who's met him.
They also gave political license to everyone who followed, including the reinvention of the Beatles themselves. The music was able to share the counterculture message. It was its soundtrack. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there. The music was so important that eventually 500,000 people went on a pilgrimage to Yasgur's farm for a Woodstock concert. A lot of the war protests came from university and college campuses. They were the institutions of higher learning, of thinking people who were just at the right age where they began to question everything, even, or especially, the circumstances that had brought us all to this point in time. The establishment. Who are they? Well, they are they. They are everyone who is not us. We're the anti-establishment. They are the authors of the Constitution, the makers of the laws, the managers of the institutions. Those are all the things that we want to change. The great democracies do run on solid constitutions, the rule of law, and strong institutions. No one was calling to end democracy. Well, maybe some were, but counterculture was calling for a change in those things, especially the laws and institutions, what they had turned into, and what purposes they could really serve for the betterment of all, for the greater good. Did we know exactly how to change the world? Perhaps. But step one was to take down the current administration and the system that they had built for their own benefit. Their values were not our values. Their beliefs weren't our beliefs. And behaviors on both sides were disapproved of by the other guy. Their uniforms were the suit and tie. Ours were the beads and the sandals and the long hair. The anti-Vietnam War protests may have helped kick-start the counterculture, but it quickly widened to include the protest of corporate America, of white America, and so forth. A straight, back then, was not a heterosexual. A straight was a buzz-cut, suit-wearing Republican with a 9-to-5 job. The counterculture was college campuses. It was Woodstock. It was the 1968 Democratic Convention, the Chicago 7, LSD, turn on, tune in, and drop out. It was happening, man. It was where it was at. We were going to make a difference. We would change the world. So what happened? I honestly don't know. At least I'm not really sure. Suddenly, the Beatles broke up. I remember going from Creedence and Dylan to the shitty sounds of James Taylor and Cat Stevens. John Denver had a career, for Christ's sakes. If there was ever a sign that a counterculture had thrown in the towel, it was the success of Rocky Mountain High. We went from Dylan and the times they are a-changin' to Cat Stevens being followed by a moon shadow. Moon shadow, moon shadow. What in the fresh hell of top 40 radio was going on? Nixon had lost to Kennedy. Geez, how many joints did I smoke? How long have I been out? Because it seemed like I blinked, and then Nixon was president. He wasn't the first crook to hold that office, but the biggest one since the invention of television, and by the way, a record he held right up until 2016, might I say. Well, we took on the system. But maybe the system was just too big. Yeah, sure, a lot of people, turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. But really only a very few could live on that. The rest of us, at some point, were forced to drop back in, get a job, feed our kids, maybe vacation in a tropical climate once a year, and start saving for our retirement. Hippies finally got that haircut and became yuppies. Some people got into the system for the purpose of changing the system from within. Probably some people did that. But more common, the system changed them. Because here's the thing about changing the world. It's time-consuming, and it's exhausting. You're battling these long-standing traditions. You're a perceived threat to people's livelihoods and way of life. Not to mention, a lot of people just aren't interested in change. More so, changing the world threatens the current system of profitability. The rich. And since the world runs on money, change is viewed with a raised eyebrow, with doubt. Big money can buy most of those big dreams and kill them. You know what else happened? We got old. It's harder to storm the Bastille when your arthritis is acting up. You know, the demonstration at the embassy conflicts with my physio appointment. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do, though. I'm going to post the tweet of a lifetime. As soon as I figure out how to increase the font size, take that, establishment, and in that next election, I'm going to go vote. If I can get a ride, well, we all do what we can do. Counterculture hasn't gone away. It probably never will. We've had several examples of it, a long time after all the hippies packed those tie-dyed T-shirts into a box in the attic. Occupy Wall Street, Arab Spring, the Orange Revolution, the Umbrella Movement, even Black Lives Matter and Me Too. Those are all countercultures. Remember social media, TV on steroids? It's to the point where all of us are our very own counterculture. Scary part is that despite all of this, the establishment has become so embedded that many of the countercultures just become white noise. So they just wait them out. You know, they pay a little lip service, maybe they even change a few things, and hope that the protests will go away. And they do. What is also odd to me now that many protests come from the right-wing factions. Right-wing movements as a counterculture? What? They contend that they are countering decades and decades of liberal democracies. Anything from the truckers' protest to the January 6th insurrections are counterculture events. Sadly, though, these lug nuts give counterculture a bad name. You can't call yourself a counterculture if you're the culture that we've been trying to counter all this time. You know what else? Their placards and their tiki torches only thinly hide their bigotry and racism. They campaign on false narratives, such as, less government. Less government, there's one. It actually sounds pretty good on first blush. Bloated politicians, out-of-control bureaucrats, wasted tax money. We'll doge them out of there. And I'm sure there are a lot of those things. But less government? Eventually that means less representation. We, the people, will have a lesser voice. That's how demagogues take over. Dictators become kings. Less waste, less bureaucracy, sure, but not less government. Are you crazy? It's both funny and frightening to me that the right has co-opted counterculture as their own for the purposes of fascism. Fascism should not be a counterculture. And their soundtrack includes Kid Rock, Lee Greenwood, and the U.S. Marine Band. So on behalf of all small L liberal Democrats, I'm hereby applying to take back counterculture. The 1960s counterculture may have failed. Okay, we didn't really change the world. We tried. But right now we should refuse to relinquish counterculture as our own intellectual property. I don't care if Steppenwolf's Born to be Wild is being used right now for a baby diaper commercial, or that honky-tonk women is part of the Muzak being played in the grocery store, or that Donald Trump inexplicably plays the Village People at his rallies. You can have all that, but you can't have counterculture. The conservatives have no right to counterculture, no matter how counter their views are to the prevailing culture. Okay, 60s, hippies, counterculture, we failed. Maybe we didn't change the world, but today, if I think I see which way the world is going, and I think I do, the world is going to need changing. Suddenly we have to wrestle it back from the autocrats and the aristocrats and the would-be monarchs. Maybe we can call ourselves the levelers. And this time around our soundtrack could be Taylor Swift and Adele and, all right, maybe we don't need a soundtrack, but now more than ever, we need to turn on, tune in, and stay focused.
Only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.